The story of Moses is really not just about documenting the early days of Hebrews moving into the Promised Land, even though it's told in the form of a story, and I will refer to it as a narrative. It is historical, and it is theology. These were real people that lived in real space and time, just like us, albeit a long time ago. But the purpose of this is not simply to prove that they existed, but to demonstrate and to teach God's people then and now about the nature of God and his relationship with his creation and his relationship with those who live in covenant relationship with him. Now, the Old Testament folks lived in the old covenant relationship with God. With Christ, all that has changed, and we live in a new covenant relationship, but it is still a covenant relationship. So these stories that we are going to look at emphasize themes like what it is to have faith in God, not just for the spectacular and the miracles like crossing the Red Sea, but for the everyday things. What it is to have a relationship with the Creator God who is engaged with his creation and his providence and care over his creation and the authority that he has over all things, including people like the Pharaoh, who was the head of the largest superpower of the day. And the Egyptians dominated politics and economics in that era. And yet God was greater, is greater. And then the faithfulness, because of this unique covenant relationship and a God who has revealed himself, who is knowable, there is a dynamic in the relationship unlike the Egyptians and the gods of Egypt, or the Canaanites and the gods of Canaan, or any other nation around Israel. There was a unique relationship between God's people and their Creator God based on this covenant that Moses presented to them after he came down from Mount Sinai. And part of these stories is to help us understand that the problems introduced in Genesis 3, when Adam and Eve sinned and rebelled against God, have been resolved through this covenant relationship and looking forward ultimately to the final resolution in Jesus Christ, most of which was accomplished on the cross, but we still look forward to that kingdom that is yet to come. So this story, although we are historically removed, culturally removed, different time and place, different kind of reality, it is intended to teach us about the nature of God, the nature of our relationship with God, because two things have not changed in the thousands of years since Moses until today. And the two things that have not changed is the nature of God and who he is and his authority over all things as creator, and our need for him and the human dilemma. The context in which that expresses itself has changed radically, but those foundational needs and the essence of God's created order has not changed. So as we go through these series of stories, these narratives, they're not just like Aesop's fables where you look for a cute little punchline or moral to take away. This is theology communicated in the form of a documentary, a truthful documentary where we see the good, the bad, and the ugly of God's people. This is historical, real people in real time and real places. Because it's a narrative, because this is theology told in story form, we're going to see, and we can expect to see, the elements of good storytelling. In fact, all of this, the first 5 books of the Old Testament that are called the law, were initially passed on through oral tradition. Yes, it was written down, but the majority of people didn't have a library in their man cave, in the back of their tent somewhere as they wandered through the wilderness. They told these stories to one another. And oral tradition, we know from anthropology, oral tradition tends to be very, very accurate in the way stories are passed on. Because one person tells the story, And it's not like the telephone game you played as kids when you sat around in a circle and the grade 3 teacher didn't know what to do for the last 20 minutes of class. This is telling a history that says these things are important and this is how you tell the story. And the story would be learned, and then the next generation would learn it and tell exactly the same story in exactly the same way. And we know that oral tradition is very accurate. It was written down, but it was passed along to one another as storytelling. And because of that, there's structure to the story. There's a plot in the story. There's the use of key words and ideas. There's repetition. There's use of poetic images. There's crisis and resolution and conflict. And yet all of that is simply used to tell us something about God. So in Exodus chapter 1, the stories begin with this significant phrase that there arose a king in Egypt who did not remember Joseph. And that's important because it was Joseph, after his own set of stories in the book of Genesis, led that core family, the initial family of 12 sons, into Egypt after he had gone through his own processes, but had set up a famine relief system for the Egyptians and the nations around. And then he brings his own family in and they are saved from the famine. But God prospers that family and they become powerful, and to the point that they intimidate, because of the number of people, they intimidate the Egyptian people themselves and the government. And they say that this subgroup, these immigrants, are growing too big and too powerful. We've got to do something to put a stop to that. And it's a problem, as we're going to see this throughout these stories, it's a problem created by God's blessing. God blessed them to have lots of kids, and they grew, and that created the crises. And that's a theme that happens throughout most of these stories, that when there's the blessing of God, it creates crises in other areas. But this king that Joseph did all this, under whom Joseph served, that Joseph accomplished all these things, he dies. And then there's no legacy, there's no understanding of this family, and they are intimidated. So we come to Exodus chapter 2, and we're in the heat of the moment where the king of the day is oppressing these Hebrew immigrants because he doesn't remember, he's not grateful for what Joseph had done at the end of Genesis and the beginning of Exodus chapter 1. So this tension is building. The story in Exodus chapter 2 that talks about the birth of Moses and then the bullying of Moses and then the bride of Moses, we're going to look at these three scenarios, is 40 years in the making. It's important to understand that. If you look at your Bible, you're going to see it was 25 verses. 40 years contained in 25 verses. So obviously there's a lot of detail that's been left out, which means the details that are here have been intentionally selected because of their importance. So when we see detail in structure, in the form, the way the story is being told, it should catch our attention because it's intentional. It's not just, oh yeah, I remember sitting around the campfire and let me tell you a story about the time I caught the big one that got away. No, there's intentionality to communicate something here, first about God, and secondly, the nature of our relationship with God. We're going to look at three scenarios. The scenario of Moses' birth, the scenario of Moses' bullying, and the scenario of Moses getting a bride. And all these scenarios in chapter 2 have this in common. They are all centered on a resolution of a life-threatening crisis. In the first scenario, the crisis is what's going to happen to the babies who are being born to the Hebrews because the Egyptians want to kill them all. In the second, there's a life-threatening crisis because as a bully, Moses kills a couple of Egyptians that are abusing some of his Hebrew brethren. And in the last one, he runs away because of his bullying tactics, and a group of women come to a well to feed their sheep, and they're threatened by some other shepherds, and Moses defends them and feeds or provides water for those ladies. So the context of these stories of these Israelites, probably in the wilderness, learning this new concept about who is our God, he starts these stories with these three illustrations from his own life: his birth, his bullying, and how he got his bride. And what's fascinating is he tells the stories, warts and all, not trying to make himself necessarily look good, but is phenomenally transparent in how he reacted, with, I think the point being, don't do what I did. In this case, yes, follow the example of my parents. Yes, follow the example of my father-in-law, but don't do what I did. So let's take a look at these three scenarios: the scenario of his birth, his bullying, and how he got the bride. And we're going to look at it from a storytelling perspective, because each story starts with an introductory comment, then there's a crisis, then there's a dialogue, and then there's this conclusion, this theological statement at the end of each of these three stories. And together, these three stories make up one full unit, telling us about who Moses is. Who is this guy who says God has told him to tell Pharaoh, let my people go? Is he a superhero? Is he a super believer? No, he's an extraordinarily inadequate person. And we see that inadequacy in these three stories. So, scenario number one, the first 10 verses of Exodus chapter 2, we have this introductory comment to set the scene for the crisis that is about to happen. Verse 1, now a man from the house of Levi went and took as his wife a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. We know that was necessary because in chapter 1, they've been told, kill all the Hebrew boys. But a couple of details that are significant here. First, Moses is purebred Levitic in his background. He comes from the tribe of Levi. And as he goes on in his leadership role over Israel, that becomes significant because his brother will be the first priest of this new nation called the Hebrews. And the priests have to come from the tribe of Levi. So Moses is purebred. But what isn't said here is equally fascinating, that Moses has an older brother and an older sister that are neglected. The first, as far as we know, the first child born to this couple was Moses' sister. The second one born was Moses' oldest brother, Aaron. The third one born is Moses himself. In the ancient culture, this is very significant. You want your firstborn to be a male, because he's the one who's going to carry on the family name. He's the one who's going to provide for mom and dad as they get old and make sure that the cares, the social cares, having a home to live in and food to eat when mom and dad are too old and not able to go out and work in the fields, that whole social security process system depended on having those boy children. And if the firstborn was a male, even better. And yet in this phenomenal family, the firstborn is a woman, and the secondborn is a male, and Moses doesn't come along till number 3. And yet Moses is the one that God uses to lead his people, the third child. That's crazy. This is culturally breaking all the rules. It's a nuance we may not pick up on, but it's extremely important. Now we see the crisis. So that's the introduction. We see this crisis in the next few verses. Verse 2. When she could hide him no longer, she took for him a basket made of bulrushes and daubed it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds by the river bank, and his sister stood at a distance to know what would be done to him. Now the daughter of Pharaoh came along to bathe at the river, and when her young women walked beside the river, she saw the basket among the reeds and sent her servant woman, and she took it. Let's think about this for a moment as parents. Could you put your kid in a homemade basket and stick it out in the middle of the river? It's like, this is crazy. But what were the parents doing? They'd get together in the evenings, I suppose, with extended family. Well, what are we going to do? How are we going to protect our kids? What are our options? I don't know. I don't know. Maybe we should run away. Maybe we should do this. Maybe we should do that. And somebody has a goofy idea. Well, let's build little baskets and put them out in the river. And everyone goes, are you crazy? There are crocodiles. There's the current. It's like, no. But for whatever reason, this is what Moses' parents decide to do. They take the baby and they put it in the river. And against all odds, it's not a crocodile that finds the baby, it is the daughter of Pharaoh. There's a hint here of God's providence, that God is caring for this little one. And they've got the daughter there to kind of keep an eye on things, and this introduces then a dialogue, starting at verse 6. When she opened it, that's the daughter of Pharaoh, she saw the child, and behold, the baby was crying. She took pity on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." Then his sister said to the Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call you a nurse from the Hebrew woman to nurse the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go." So the girl went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed him. Wow. This is God's providence. This is what's going to happen in 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. And Moses said, "This is how my life started. God did an amazing thing. So my mom was able to raise me, and my sister looked after me. This is against all odds." And then there's this concluding statement of verse 10. When the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses because she said, "I drew him out of the water." So this faithfulness on behalf of the mom, trusting God, and then giving the baby back, how hard would that be? I can't even begin to think about that. Taking my child and giving it to a stranger who does not worship the God I worship, and wow, saying goodbye forever. This is phenomenal. Just let your parenting instincts take over for a moment and think about this. And yet, this mom trusts God that this is a better scenario than having the kid murdered. And this concluding statement of Pharaoh's daughter that this one became her son. So that's scenario number one, peppered with all kinds of obvious fingerprints from God, the providence of God. That's a good story. We like that one. That's great. God provided. Here's a crisis. Baby's going to get killed. Came up with a creative idea. Probably everybody thought they were nuts. It doesn't say that, but I'm thinking if somebody suggested that to me, "Hey, let's put the babies in Lake Ontario." I'm thinking, no, not the best of ideas. But God does an amazing thing. In fact, it's almost hard to believe. It's so amazing. So we come to story number two, scenario number two. Moses' birth, now Moses bullying. And this takes place probably about 40 years later. Because after this, Moses runs into the wilderness. Well, maybe not quite 40 years, but he runs into the wilderness and he's gone. The first part of his life is 40 years. So several years later, here again is this introductory comment and a crisis. Verse 11. One day when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and looked on their burdens, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. Moses never lost his sense of identity. Even though he was viewed as an Egyptian and he had that royal essence about him, he still understood himself as being a Hebrew. He looked this way and that way, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. He murders a guy. This is the man who's going to lead God's people out of bondage into the promised land, and he's committed murder. Oh, it was justified. No, I don't think so. I don't see any rationale here for it. And then, so this is the crisis. And then there's a dialogue following the same pattern as the previous story. And when he went out the next day, behold, two Hebrews were struggling together. And he said to the man in the wrong, "Why did you strike your companion?" He answered, "Who made you prince and judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Uh-oh. Somehow, Moses' private act wasn't so private. The word is out. And his reaction, the very next line, then Moses was afraid and thought, surely the thing is known. I've messed up and I tried to cover up and it didn't work and I am in trouble. Verse 15, when Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses. And we see that theme throughout the story of the Exodus, of this alienation, of this conflict. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. So in this interlude story, Moses is faced with a crisis, but unlike the first crisis, there is no divine intervention. There's no providential act. Moses acts out of anger, just he reacts. And this is something we see typical of Moses' character. When he was up on Sinai and he comes down and he sees his brother has built the golden calf, he gets angry and he smashes the tablets. When they're wandering around the wilderness and God says, he says, we don't have enough water, and God says, strike the rock, he gets angry and he strikes it twice, and he ends up paying for that one significantly. Moses had some kind of a temper. And he's not this passive, sitting on top of the mountain guru kind of a guy that's just filled with wisdom and insight about God. He's get riled up. He's a regular guy. And he documents this, that I have done this horrible thing. I murdered an Egyptian. And although there's no statement here that that is wrong, all of this is in the context of Moses receiving the law from God, and part of which says, thou shalt not kill. And here Moses has done that. Because Moses' transparency, his authenticity, and again, it's the Holy Spirit pulling these stories together, making sure that exactly what's written is exactly what he wants written, tells us that Moses, for all the hero that he is, had these foibles. And then scenario number 3, Moses' bride. So he's sitting by the well. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and they drew water to fill the troughs to water their father's flock. That's the introduction to this story. Now we have a crisis. Some shepherds came and drove them away. The work's already done. Why wouldn't you? Stand back, watch these ladies fill up all the troughs for the animals. As soon as the work is done, they come, they drive the animals away, and they take advantage. But Moses stood up and saved them. So in the previous story, Moses saw an injustice and he acted inappropriately and murdered a guy. Here he sees an injustice, he stands up and he acts much more appropriately. And he watered their flock. So then they engage in a dialogue. So each one of these stories has had that introduction, then a crisis moment, and then a series of conversations, a dialogue. Verse 18. And when they came home to their father, Reuel, he said, how is it that you've come home so soon today? And they said, an Egyptian delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds. So see, they perceived Moses as an Egyptian. His body language, his speaking, his everything about him said Egyptian, because that was his uprising. But he identified, we saw from the previous story, himself, he identified as a Hebrew. An Egyptian delivered us out of the hand of shepherds and even drew water for us and watered the flock. And he said to his daughters, then where is he? Why have you left the man? Call him that he may eat bread. So the father is very grateful. Now I'm going to just use my sanctified imagination here a little bit. We don't know how many daughters there were, but obviously they had been entrusted with the sheep or the flocks of this man. So he must have been a wealthy guy. There's probably more than one of them. And here's Moses all by himself, and there are these women at the well. And he has a chance to play the hero. Which one of us guys wouldn't want to do that, right? Impress the ladies. And he does that. And it's like, then he just sits down. And the girls go, okay, thanks, Moses. And they trot on home. And the dad says, bring him back. We got to at least feed this guy. And I suspect Moses is like, yes, finally, a good meal. Because he's been wandering away, running away from the Egyptians. And now this family that's obviously wealthy and has some daughters have invited him for a meal. And then look what happens. Verse 21. And Moses was content to dwell with the man. No kidding. He's got some daughters. He's probably wealthy. It makes sense. And he gave Moses his daughter, Zipporah. So he now gets a bride. How cool is that? And she gave birth to a son. How cool is that? And called his name Gershom, for he said, I have been a sojourner in a foreign land. These 3 stories focus on crisis and conflict resolution, especially between the Hebrews and the foreigners. In 2 of the stories, the first one and the last one, there's, even though it doesn't say it, there's very clear providential intervention. The middle story, God just gets mad. So that middle story serves as a contrast to the first 2. Here's what happens when I take things into my own hands. And it goes sideways. It just falls apart for Moses, and he ends up having to run away and fear for his life. But in the 2 conflicts where there is a sense of dependence on God, even though it doesn't say it exactly. But Moses, he does this thing at the well, and it's all he can do, and he leaves it. His parents take this crazy act of putting him in a basket and sticking him out in the water. They've done all they can do. God's care for his people is inexplicable, and that's the point of the story. And then there's this concluding summary in verse 23. During those many days, the king of Egypt died, the king who had forgotten, who did not know Joseph, back in chapter 1. And the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery, and they cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God. Here's the point. This is the theology. God heard their groaning. And God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. So these three stories, where there's crisis and conflict, are just mini illustrations of what's happening in the bigger story of the nation of the Hebrews, the ancient Israelites, in their suffering and their dependence upon God. They cry out, and even though the solution has not yet been provided, this is a lesson about the nature and character of God. Not about how to manipulate him, not about how we can get what we want, but when they cried out, unlike the gods of the nations around them, their call came up to God. He heard their groaning. He remembered the covenant. What has Moses, as he tells this story to the Israelites, presumably sitting around the wilderness waiting to go into the promised land, what has Moses been doing? He's been going up and down Mount Sinai, getting the covenant from God, getting it in written form and teaching the people, this is who your God is. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. And he tells this story saying, God remembered his covenant even with your forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And God sees his people. And as they were wandering, sitting around there in their tents in the wilderness, they probably wondered more than once, where is God? In fact, we know they did, because they complained. And they said to Moses, enough already. Take us back to Egypt. We want to go back. This is miserable. We were better off back there. Where is God? Ever asked that question? We all have. We struggle in our faith, and God seems far away and disconnected. So what's the point? I think there are two major points in this entire narrative as a set. We have to look at it at the big picture. First, that Moses tells his own backstory from the most honest and transparent of perspective, his extraordinary inadequacy, so he can highlight God's amazing work. That it's not what Moses did or Moses' parents did. It's not even what Moses didn't do. Or was God limited by Moses' act of murder? But Moses' backstory, his transparency shows us that God cannot be sidelined no matter what we may or may not do, or the circumstances in which we find ourselves. There is nothing that places limits on God. The threats against the Hebrew babies, Moses' impetuous nature to kill an Egyptian, his fleeing and ending up beside some random well out in the desert. And yet God brought all those things together in preparation for bringing his people out of bondage. So we cannot place limits on God, no matter what our track record or our history has been. Secondly, this same God is the God who remembers and sees his people. If Moses' sister can watch over a baby, if Pharaoh's daughter can find and care for a random baby in the Nile River, if even the most private of secrets that Moses was carrying can be shared in his authenticity and obviously the work of the Holy Spirit, and if a chance meeting at a well can result in finding a bride and having a baby and creating and being part of this new nation and preparing to lead them, then how much does God see, care, and respond to us, even though his timing may be confusing? and his processes and the people he uses. His style may be surprising, and the agent of his provision may even be dysfunctional. But God does see, he does hear, he does care, he does respond, and he does redeem the stuff of life. And that's part of the whole story of Moses and the Exodus, that God is a redeeming God. They cried out for help, and God heard, but he didn't fix it right away. In fact, it got worse before it got better. But that was for reasons, to be honest, we don't fully understand. I'm not going to presume to speak for God and say, God did it this way because he wanted this. But ultimately, it was so that they would learn who their God was. And there was only one path to learn that. And that was through crisis and then crisis resolution. So this is not a story of A versus B and do the right things and you get what you want. This is a story that reminds us that God is not surprised by crises. God is not deterred by our poor choices. And we really don't have control, but God does. God is aware, he responds, he hears, and he cares. And this is the frustrating thing about faith. Because we want faith to be an input-output kind of a thing. If I do the right inputs, then God will honor that and I'll get the right outputs. And we live in that kind of culture, especially with technology. If I put the right kind of thing in, I ought to get the right kind of thing back. Our society is all about understanding mechanics. And we can drill down to the nanostructure of DNA, and we can adjust this genetic thing a little bit to make this product or this plant less drought susceptible, or we can change resistance to disease, and we love, if I can tweak this, then I can look at the good I can do, and then we come to God and it doesn't work that way. We're not in control, but God is. And part of these stories, a major lesson in these three stories that form a larger story, is that faith can be frustrating. But even when we react poorly, God is not limited. And in every scenario, he is listening, he is engaged, he is caring, because we are in a covenant relationship with him, just as Israel was way back when. So tweaking their concept of God, that's part of these stories. And as we go through some further stories in the narrative of Moses, we see this is a lesson that they learn or need to learn over and over and over again and never really get there, at least not all of them. But of course, that's not like us. We don't struggle with those faith issues, do we?